February 1, 1942, Central Pacific Ocean. The USS Enterprise was running for her life. Just 8 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, America's first offensive carrier strike, a raid on Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands, had turned into a desperate retreat. Now, 5 Mitsubishi bombers were screaming toward the carrier at 10,000 feet. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with tracers. 4 bombers missed and veered away. The 5th, piloted by Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai, did not turn. His aircraft was already dying, shredded by American Wildcats and streaming fire. Nakai knew he would never make it home, so he made a choice, one that wouldn't become common for another 2 years, and aimed his burning plane straight for the Enterprise's flight deck. Below, on the catwalk, 25-year-old aviation machinist Bruno Gaido watched the bomber grow larger. Every gun on the ship was firing. It wasn't enough. In seconds, the Enterprise, America's most valuable warship in the Pacific, would be an inferno. Gaido did the only thing he could think of. He ran, not away from the danger, but straight toward it. He sprinted across the open deck, scrambled into the rear seat of a parked SBD Dauntless dive bomber, and grabbed the twin 30-caliber machine guns. Swiveling them toward the approaching Kamikaze, he opened fire. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary acts of individual bravery in naval aviation history. But Bruno Gaido's story, and the sacrifice that would follow, was only beginning. A young man's calling. Bruno Gaido wanted to join the Navy the moment he could. To a young man from a working-class Milwaukee family, it offered steady pay, 3 meals a day, and something more: purpose. His father, John, said no. He'd seen enough of the world to know the cost of military service and insisted his 18-year-old son wait. For 6 long years, Bruno worked odd jobs on farms and in a brewery, watching as the world darkened, Germany rearming, Japan on the march. By 1940, even his cautious father knew war was coming. That October, Bruno finally enlisted. After boot camp, he was assigned to Pearl Harbor as an aviation machinist, learning to maintain the complex engines of Navy aircraft. In July 1941, he was temporarily assigned to Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6, flying from the USS Enterprise. But Gaido had a way of making himself indispensable. He qualified as a rear-seat gunner and built a reputation for a quality the Navy valued above almost all else: toughness. One incident became legend. In June 1941, a new pilot, Lieutenant Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, was set for his first carrier landing, a dangerous maneuver done solo, with sandbags in the rear seat to minimize risk. When Kleiss climbed into his Dauntless, Gaido found Bruno Gaido already strapped in the back. "What the hell are you doing here? This is my qual flight. Get out!" Kleiss demanded. Gaido didn't move. "You got wings, don't you?" Kleiss would later say Gaido's confidence transformed his own nerves. He made 6 perfect landings that day. Dusty Kleiss would go on to become one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots of World War II, scoring direct hits on 3 Japanese ships at Midway. He never forgot the machinist who believed in him when it mattered most. War. On December 7, 1941, Gaido was not at Pearl Harbor. He was aboard the Enterprise, returning from a mission. Heavy weather had delayed the carrier's arrival by 1 day, a delay that likely saved the ship. That evening, the Enterprise crept into a harbor still shrouded in smoke and tragedy. "Where in hell were you?" angry voices called from the docks. By December 9th, the Enterprise was back at sea, one of only 3 operational U.S. carriers in the Pacific. Over the next brutal weeks, Japan advanced relentlessly. America needed to hit back. On February 1, 1942, the Enterprise launched the first American offensive strike of the Pacific War, raiding Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands. It was payback, small but symbolic. As the carrier retreated that afternoon, Nakai's bomber made its fateful run. The duel. From the bridge, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey watched the scene unfold. One man, alone, running into the path of a suicide plane. Gaido stood in the rear seat of the Dauntless, firing point-blank into the approaching cockpit. At the last second, the Enterprise turned hard. Gaido's fire, combined with the ship's maneuver, caused the bomber to shear off the Dauntless's tail, just 3 feet from where Gaido stood firing, before crashing into the sea. Calmly, Gaido then used the plane's fire extinguisher to douse the flames on the deck, before disappearing into the ship's interior, certain he'd be punished for leaving his battle station. When Admiral Halsey ordered him found and brought to the bridge, Gaido stood at attention, expecting reprimand. Instead, Halsey smiled. "Consider yourself promoted." On the spot, Gaido was advanced from Machinist's Mate 3rd Class to 1st Class. In the months that followed, Gaido continued as a machinist and gunner. Then came Midway. On June 4, 1942, Gaido climbed into the rear seat of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber piloted by Ensign Frank W. O'Flaherty. Their target was the Japanese carrier Kaga. In the decisive dive that helped sink the Kaga, Gaido provided vital rear defense. But on the return, low on fuel and damaged, O'Flaherty ditched the plane at sea. The 2 men were picked up not by American rescuers, but by the Japanese destroyer Makigumo. For 11 days they were held and interrogated. Japanese records later claimed Gaido gave information, but those who knew him refused to believe it. This was the man who ran toward a kamikaze. On June 15, 1942, O'Flaherty and Gaido were bound to weighted fuel cans and thrown overboard into the Pacific. Legacy. Bruno Gaido's fate remained unknown for 3 years. His mother, Clementina, received a missing inactive telegram and died less than 2 months later, the family said, of a broken heart. In 1943, Gaido was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, the full story emerged. The Makigumo had been sunk on February 1, 1943, exactly 1 year after Gaido saved the Enterprise. Bruno Gaido served only 20 months in the Navy. In that short time, he helped launch America's first Pacific offensive, saved its most important carrier, and helped turn the tide at Midway. His name is inscribed on the Courts of the Missing in Honolulu. Dusty Kleiss, the pilot he once steadied, lived to 100. In his memoir, he devoted pages to Gaido, the machinist who asked, "You got wings, don't you?" Bruno Gaido didn't live to see victory. He died in darkness, in the very waters where he helped change history. But in one moment on a burning flight deck, he showed what one person can do when courage means running toward the fire, not away from it. A Milwaukee boy, a nation's call. Bruno Gaido was born on September 14, 1916, in the working-class neighborhoods of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the son of Italian immigrants, John and Clementina Gaido, who understood the value of labor, thrift, and family. The America of Bruno's youth was one of promise shadowed by hardship, emerging from the Great War and plunging into the Great Depression. For a young man like Bruno, prospects were often measured in the stability of a paycheck. The military offered that. It promised 3 square meals a day, a steady income, and a chance to see something beyond the factories and breweries of Milwaukee. More abstractly, it offered purpose, a structured path in an uncertain world. Bruno wanted to enlist in the Navy as soon as he was able. His father, John, a man who had likely seen enough of the world's rough edges, said no. He believed his son, at 18, was too young. He knew the military could break a man as easily as it could make him, and he wanted Bruno to wait, to be sure. For 6 long years, Bruno waited. He bounced between odd jobs, farm work, shifts at a local brewery, watching as the world beyond Wisconsin's borders grew increasingly unstable and grim. Newsreels showed Hitler rearming Germany, Mussolini posturing in Rome, and the Imperial Japanese forces marching through Manchuria and China. The drumbeat of coming conflict was faint at first, then unmistakable. By 1940, even John Gaido's protective caution was overruled by the gathering storm. In October of that year, Bruno, now 24, finally enlisted in the United States Navy. His initial training was typical. Boot camp forged a sailor out of a civilian. Following that, his mechanical aptitude and steady hands steered him toward aviation. He was designated an Aviation Machinist's Mate, an AMM, a crucial trade in the new age of naval warfare, where air power was swiftly becoming the fleet's decisive arm. The machinist's mate was the heart of the squadron, the man who kept the complex, temperamental radial engines of the Navy's aircraft singing. Theirs was a world of grease, torque wrenches, compression checks, and the sacred responsibility of trust. A pilot's life literally depended on their work. In the summer of 1941, Gaido was assigned to Naval Air Station Pearl Harbor on Ford Island. It was the buzzing, oily, vibrant nerve center of the Pacific Fleet's air operations. Here, amidst the tropical heat and the constant roar of engines, he began his specialized training. In July, he received what was meant to be a temporary assignment. He was sent to the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, CV-6, to work with Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6, which flew the rugged, gull-winged Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The assignment was supposed to be a rotational detail, a chance for a shore-based mechanic to learn the unique rhythms and demands of carrier aviation. But Bruno Gaido, quiet, competent, and fiercely determined, had a way of making himself indispensable. He didn't just maintain the planes, he sought to understand them in their entirety. He qualified as an aviation gunner, mastering the twin .30 caliber machine guns in the Dauntless's rear cockpit. The SBD was a 2-man aircraft, the pilot up front, guiding it through its near-vertical dives, the rear seat man, often called the radio man gunner, handling communications and defending against enemy fighters from behind. Gaido quickly developed a reputation. It wasn't just for technical skill, but for a particular brand of cool, unflappable toughness. This reputation was cemented in an incident that became part of Enterprise squadron lore, a story passed among pilots and crewmen even before the war began. In June 1941, a newly winged naval aviator, Ensign Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss, reported to VS-6. One of the most perilous rites of passage for any carrier pilot was his first landing aboard a moving ship, a controlled crash onto a postage-stamped deck, pitching in the open sea. Standard procedure for these qualification flights was to fly solo, with sandbags strapped into the rear gunner seat to simulate the weight. The reason was grimly pragmatic. If the novice pilot missed the arresting wires, slammed into the crash barrier, or plunged over the side, only one life would be lost. When Kleiss climbed into his assigned Dauntless on the day of his qualifiers, he expected to see sandbags. Instead, he found Bruno Gaido already there, strapped into the rear seat, a faint, confident grin on his face. "What the hell are you doing here?" Kleiss demanded, his own nervousness spiking. "This is my qual flight. Get out!"
Gaido didn't move. He simply looked at the young pilot and said, "You got wings, don't you?" Kleiss argued, protested, even tried to order him out. Gaido remained a picture of calm resolve. His silent message was clear: "I believe you can do this. Now prove it." Years later, Kleiss would reflect that Gaido's unshakable confidence transformed his own fear into focus. If this mechanic, who understood the machinery and the risk better than anyone, was willing to bet his life on Kleiss's skill, then Kleiss could believe in himself. He executed 6 perfect landings that day. Dusty Kleiss would go on to become a legend, one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots of World War II, the only pilot to score direct hits on 3 different Japanese ships at the Battle of Midway. He received the Navy Cross and lived to be 100 years old. But he never forgot the quiet mechanic whose faith, expressed in that simple, challenging question, steadied his hand at the very start. It was a quintessential Bruno Gaido moment. Action over words, trust over protocol, a silent pact between the man who flew the plane and the man who kept it flying.
The tide turns at Midway. The spring of 1942 was a period of tense, limited operations. The Enterprise struck at Wake Island and Marcus Island. In April, she provided cover for the audacious Doolittle raid, a morale-boosting strike on Tokyo itself. Yet strategically, Japan still held the initiative. Then, American cryptanalysts achieved a monumental intelligence coup. They broke Japanese naval codes and discerned the enemy's next major objective, a tiny strategic atoll known as Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and annihilate them. He committed 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to the operation. Admiral Nimitz, gambling with everything, positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to ambush the ambushers. In the tense days leading up to the battle, Bruno Gaido performed his duties. He tuned engines, checked spark plugs, and prepared the Dauntlesses of VS-6 for the fight of their lives. When the squadron roster was drawn up, he was assigned to fly as rear seat gunner for Ensign Frank Woodrow O'Flaherty, a young pilot from South Carolina. June 4, 1942 dawned with catastrophe for American air power. Torpedo Squadrons 8, 6, and 3 launched brave, doomed attacks against the Japanese carrier fleet. Flying slow, low-flying devastators, they were slaughtered by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Not a single torpedo hit its target. The sacrifice, however, was not in vain. Their attacks pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level and disrupted the enemy's deck operations, leaving the skies above the Japanese carriers momentarily vulnerable. At that precise moment, high above the chaos, 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, including VS-6, and 1 from the Yorktown, arrived. Spotting the unmistakable long white wakes of the Japanese carriers below, they nosed over into their near-vertical dives. In the rear seat of O'Flaherty's Dauntless, Bruno Gaido felt the sudden gut-clenching drop as the plane tipped over. The horizon vanished, replaced by a spinning view of blue ocean and the shrinking shape of a carrier, the Kaga, growing larger with terrifying speed. Gaido's job was to scan the sky behind them for Zeros, his hands on his twin Brownings. He couldn't see the dive, but he could feel the G-forces, hear the rising scream of the wind, and sense the absolute focus of his pilot ahead of him. At about 1,500 feet, O'Flaherty released their 500-pound bomb. It was a near miss, exploding close alongside the Kaga's hull.
but others in the squadron were dead accurate. In what would later be called 5 minutes that changed the world, bombs from Enterprise and Yorktown SBDs smashed into the flight decks Kamikaze, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The American dive bombers, their mission accomplished, regrouped and turned for home. O'Flaherty and Gaido joined a small formation of 6 SBDs led by Lieutenant Charles R. Ware. They were low on fuel and alone. They were also not alone for long. 6 Zero fighters from the surviving carrier Hiryu, bloodied and furious, pounced on the slow Dauntlesses. What ensued was a desperate running gunfight. Ware implemented a defensive tactic, turning the formation toward each attacking Zero to allow all 6 rear gunners to concentrate fire. Gaido, drawing on every ounce of his skill and nerve, fired burst after burst at the slashing Japanese fighters. The tactic worked. 2 Zeros were damaged and broke off, but the engagement consumed precious fuel and time. It soon became agonizingly clear to O'Flaherty that his Dauntless, perhaps holed in the fight or simply too fuel-thirsty from the long mission, would not make it back to the Enterprise. With a calm finality, he informed Gaido they would have to ditch. As the other SBDs dwindled on the horizon, O'Flaherty set the plane down as gently as possible on the open swells of the Pacific, roughly 20 miles from the still-burning Japanese fleet. The 2 men scrambled out as the Dauntless began to sink. They inflated their small one-man rubber raft. They had to share it and clung to hope. Another VS-6 pilot, Lieutenant J.G. James R. McCarthy, saw them get into the raft and marked their position before heading home. Rescue, they believed, was only a matter of time. It was a hope that would die hard. The destroyer that found them first flew the Rising Sun flag. It was the Makigumo, a modern Yugimoto-class destroyer screening the decimated Japanese fleet. Her crew, having witnessed 3 of their proud carriers destroyed in a single morning, was in a state of shock and towering rage. The sight of 2 American airmen, plucked from the water where their comrades lay dead, did not inspire mercy. Ensign Frank O'Flaherty and aviation machinist fast Bruno Gaido became prisoners of war of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Part 4. Into the Darkness. For 11 days, O'Flaherty and Gaido were held aboard the Makigumo. The details of their captivity, pieced together from post-war interrogations of the destroyer's surviving crew, paint a bleak picture. They were interrogated intensely. The Japanese wanted information, details about American carrier strength, the whereabouts of other U.S. forces, the defenses of Midway Island. The official Japanese accounts, written later, claim that Gaido provided useful information about Midway's defenses. This claim is almost certainly false and is regarded by historians as either fabrication or the result of coerced statements. Bruno Gaido was a carrier-based mechanic and gunner. He had never set foot on Midway Atoll. He knew about engines, spark plugs, and carrier deck procedures, not the placement of coastal guns or troop implantments on a remote island. Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, retired, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, has offered a plausible assessment. My assessment is that O'Flaherty and Gaido, possibly under torture, gave up plausible but phony information. Certainly, everyone who knew Gaido adamantly believed he would not have cracked. Cracking was not in Bruno Gaido's character. This was the man who ran toward a kamikaze, the man who stared down a nervous pilot and said, "You got wings, don't you?" His was a quiet, stubborn, physical courage, the kind that endures, not boasts. While the conditions aboard the Makigumo were undoubtedly harsh, the notion that he gave up actionable intelligence contradicts everything known about him. On June 15, 1942, 11 days after their capture, and as the Makigumo retreated with the decimated Japanese fleet, the prisoner's fate was sealed. The ship's captain, Commander Isamu Fujita, reportedly received orders to dispose of the prisoners. According to testimonies gathered after the war, Fujita initially asked for volunteers among the crew to carry out the execution. Stunned by the request, and perhaps harboring some last shred naval honor, the crew refused. No one stepped forward. The order, however, stood. Later that night, a small designated group of sailors was commanded, not asked, to perform the deed. O'Flaherty and aviation machinist fast Bruno Gaido were brought on deck. Their hands were bound behind their backs. Heavy weights, described as empty fuel cans or shell casings, were tied to their legs. There was no blindfold, no last words recorded for history. They were thrown alive into the dark, cold waters of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles from any land, to drown. Japanese accounts state that both men met their end with stoic dignity. It is a detail that, whether true or apocryphal, feels fitting for Bruno Gaido. He had faced death openly on the flight deck of the Enterprise. He would not have cowered from it in the final, brutal moments in the middle of the ocean he had helped to contest. Part 5. The Long Silence and the Flickering Flame. Back in the United States and aboard the victorious Enterprise, the fates of O'Flaherty and Gaido were a mystery. They were initially listed as missing in action following the Battle of Midway. For Bruno's family in Milwaukee, his father John, and especially his mother Clementina, the notification began an agony of uncertainty. The missing status was a special kind of torture, a limbo between hope and grief. Clementina Gaido, a mother who had already reluctantly given her son to the war, could not bear the not knowing. The family later said the stress and sorrow eroded her health. She died in August 1942, less than 2 months after Bruno was reported missing, never learning his son's fate. In April 19